Like, ha, can you believe they missed that? Referring to the Hans Blix team of UN inspectors who have been looking for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or evidence that the weapons of mass destruction Iraq was known to possess in 1998, that those weapons have been destroyed. So far, that evidence has not been provided. Hans Blix is sounding more and more frustrated with the lack of cooperation from the Iraqis. Ambassador David Sheffer, former war crimes ambassador at large, is with us, still keeping an eye on the Powell speech. Mr. Ambassador, how direct, how blunt do you expect him to be? Is he going to couch this in diplomatic language, or is he going to say, look, you know, the guy can't be trusted, he's a liar? What's it going to sound like? You know,
Secretary Powell has the amazing talent to be both blunt and diplomatic all in the same statement. He did this during the Persian Gulf War. You might recall that briefing militarily where he said, first we're going to cut him off and then we're going to kill him. But the whole rest of the briefing was quite diplomatic in terms of a military briefing. So he has the ability to find the line or the two lines that will capture the attention and seize the headlines, and you might see something like that today in his delivery.
How much nervousness, I guess, is there, or anticipation maybe, among some of those heavyweight diplomats that you said have flown in for this speech? What are they expecting to hear? What are they feeling this morning?
Well, they're probably in a very awkward position in that chamber, because many of them, particularly the German foreign minister and others, have articulated very skeptical views about the American initiative with respect to Iraq. But I must say, I think there's going to be a good dynamic in the Council today. First, the United States brings a discipline to the Council in terms of bringing Iraq front and center, and has been for months. That's good for the Council. But at the same time, the Security Council and our allies and friends on the Council bring a discipline to the American initiative. Namely, how do you build a coalition? How do you build the kind of support and make the case for a military action and enforcement action, as Senator Biden said this morning, that appears so imminent? How do you make that case and persuade others? The Council provides that forum. That's its purpose, is to bring those arguments together and see if you can prevail in that forum with a solid case. We've done it before many times in the history of the United Nations. This is another critical historic moment when we need to be as persuasive as possible in order to build that coalition.
But as we've noted, Iraq has already tried to pre-butt what the Secretary will have to say, calling these, lies and deceptions and so forth. Have they succeeded in planting some seeds of doubt?
I really don't think so. I don't think there's any government there that holds the brief for the Iraqi government. Everyone is skeptical of the Iraqi government, and the Security Council has been quite unified ever since the Gulf War on seeking to discipline Iraq and enforce its resolutions. The problem is, has the Security Council taken the final step to bring this to closure? That's what the United States has brought to the Council, but now it needs to be persuasive enough that it makes the case that military action is actually required now, as opposed to perhaps 6 months, 8 months, or 12 months from now. That's the test.
Ambassador David Sheffer, thanks for being our guest this morning.
Thank you.
32 minutes away now from the biggest speech of Colin Powell's career. He will try to convince the UN Security Council that Saddam Hussein has been stiffing, stalling, sandbagging, whatever the term is that you want to choose. He has been putting it to the United Nations inspectors. Secretary Powell says he has the evidence. Select members of Congress, like Joe Biden, have already seen it this morning, they say. With that, Joe Biden said he could get a conviction. Let's turn it over to my colleague Shepard Smith for special coverage of Secretary of State Colin Powell at the UN. That coverage starts now.
You are looking live, the United Nations in New York, where Secretary of State Colin Powell is set to lay out the case against Iraq. U.S. officials tell Fox News the Secretary of State is armed with the voice recordings of intercepted communications caught on tape. The Iraqis, in their own words, trying to deceive the United Nations. You are looking live inside the building where the Secretary of State Colin Powell has just arrived. This, one of the most important speeches by an American at the United Nations in recent memory. Now the head inspector, Hans Blix, warning Saddam that time is running out.
Isn't there 5 minutes to midnight in your political assessment?
The diplomatic window is closing.
It closes. The Secretary of State, Colin Powell, presents the case against Iraq.
This is Fox News Channel's special coverage of Secretary of State Colin Powell's address to the United Nations Security Council. Now, from New York, Shepard Smith.
And good morning from New York. 10 o'clock in the east now, 7 o'clock in the west. 5 minutes to midnight, as Hans Blix put it, inside Baghdad. The case to be made today. He must not prove. The Iraqis must, in the end, prove that they are disarmed, that they are cooperating, and at this moment, they are playing by United Nations rules. So far, they have not made that case. The Secretary of State, Colin Powell, to make his today. The exact details of what we will learn still undecided, but as you can see, Colin Powell now walking live through the corridors, and he's expected to begin in just about 30 minutes. This event to begin at 10:15 local time with the opening statements, and we are expecting that we may in fact hear from Kofi Annan himself. We have a team of experts and correspondents on standby this morning. Let's begin with our senior correspondent, Eric Shawn, who's live at the United Nations. Hello, Eric.
Hello, Shepard. It is now time for Colin Powell to lay out his case. What the administration says is the proof that Saddam Hussein and Iraq has been violating Resolution 1441, thumbing their nose at the world body and the globe. The audience that Colin Powell will try and present this information to, not just the diplomats and foreign ministers in the Security Council, but also world opinion. We should look out for several key points when he makes his presentation, expected to last about 90 minutes or so. One of the people who will be inside listening very intently to what Secretary Powell has to say will be Hans Blix, the Chief Weapons Inspector. He has said that he would like to have more information on sites that the Americans suspect are sites of weapons of mass destruction, such as laboratories and the like. Hans Blix saying he believes that the Iraqis have been bugging his inspectors in their hotel rooms and in their offices. Blix making it very clear here yesterday in his own words that this timeline shows it is now 5 minutes to midnight in his diplomatic jargon, meaning the end is very close for the end of diplomatic discussions before potential military action. Powell will be trying to present the case to the 11 nations on the 15-member Security Council who have been saying to give the inspectors more time and who are against immediate military action. So far, the U.S., Britain, Spain, and Bulgaria are 4 of the 15 nations that have taken the toughest line against Iraq. Powell speaking to the other nations, trying to sway their views that Iraq should have more time. Shepard.
All right, Eric Shawn live at the United Nations. Let's go live now to our senior White House correspondent, Jim Angle, who's on the North Lawn this hour. Jim?
Hello, Shep. Well, Secretary of State Powell is clearly the greatest champion in this administration of diplomatic efforts, but he'll go to the UN today and say that is not working, that Iraq is not cooperating and shows no signs of its intention to cooperate, making a very tough case that one senator said up here this morning after he was briefed on what Powell is likely to say, that he could get a jury conviction if this were a jury trial based on the evidence Powell will present, but noted that Powell will face a much tougher jury. That is why the United States has decided to declassify all sorts of intelligence, including, Shep, as we reported last night, that they will actually play recordings of intercepted communications between Iraqi officials trying to deceive the arms inspectors. This is the first time since 1983 when Soviet pilots shot down a civilian airliner and intercepts showed that they knew it was a civilian airliner. The first time since 1983 that the U.S. has actually played communications intercepts, very sensitive intelligence. There will also be satellite photos. There will be reports from defectors about mobile biochemical labs and a good deal of detail on that. There was a long and serious debate, Shep, as you know, over whether or not and how much to declassify intelligence. It is a rare thing, says one official. It is not done every day, but there are times when it is important for a key historical moment. That appears to be one of these days. This day appears to be one of those days, Shep.
All right, Jim Angle live for us at the White House. Jim, thanks very much. Let's go to Greg Palcott now, our Fox News correspondent who's live inside Baghdad. Greg?
Hey, Shepard, lies and fabrications. That's what the Iraqi media is already calling that evidence soon to be put before the UN Security Council by Secretary of State Colin Powell. The morning newspapers here filled with diatribes against Powell and the information that he will be presenting. The attention being given, the huge amount of attention being given to this presentation, a sign of how crucial the regime here sees this event. One newspaper declaring that all the images, all the audio tapes will be fabricated. The Iraqi people will not be allowed to watch this live. They can't take international news channels in on their televisions, but at least two top aides to Iraqi President Saddam Hussein will be watching. We will be watching with them. We will give you their reaction to the real thing as soon as we have it. Meanwhile, the weapons inspections, what this is really all about, continue today. Inspectors visiting several sites, including the main nuclear facility for Iraqi President Saddam Hussein's nuclear program. Also, another facility regarding biological weapons, and also a laser research center. Yesterday, yet another undeclared chemical warhead was discovered at another facility. Finally, it was a family affair on Iraqi television last night. In attendance yesterday, what's become regularly aired meetings between Saddam Hussein and his security staff, his two sons, Uday, who is the head of one very tough commando unit called Saddam's Martyrs, and Quzay, who is the heir apparent, deemed here anyway, the heir apparent to Saddam Hussein, and he also runs the Special Republican Guards, that very elite unit. Once again, Shepard, the evidence to be presented by Secretary of State Powell being watched very closely here, already has been slammed. We'll be giving you the reaction as soon as we get it. Back to you.
All right, Greg Palcott live inside Baghdad. Of course, we're expecting to hear from an official from inside Iraq as well today. The Iraqis asked to make a speech today, though they don't really have to make the request. They're certainly entitled to do so, and we're expecting that sometime later in the morning, if not in the early afternoon. And after, we'll, of course, go back to our correspondent, Greg Palcott, to our bureau inside Baghdad to keep tabs on what's happening there. In the meantime, Bill Kristol's joining me now, the former chief of staff for the vice president under Bush 41, who's sort of seen this come and go before. How important a speech is this?
Well, it's quite important, though, on the other hand, I think we've made a lot of progress with those Europeans with whom we can't make progress already. The European Union had a statement today seeming to me to move towards supporting the U.S. ultimately through the Security Council. We'll have a letter, I guess, from 10 more European nations joining the 8 who've already signed a different letter basically supporting President Bush. On the other hand, this is national, international television, and Powell will make a strong case, I think.
I read a poll this morning. I believe it was from Zogby, though I'm not entirely sure of that. It said 9 out of 10 Americans see the speech as a turning point for them on their feelings about Iraq. I guess that's one audience. Is the French a bigger audience? Or is France a bigger audience?
Yeah, the French government. I mean, I think, in truth, if Powell makes a compelling presentation, which I expect him to do, it'll give the French government an excuse to come back to support us if they want to, which we're not sure about, though I rather expect they will. I think they'll decide to be in on the play at the end of the day instead of posturing out there against us. The one thing I would say, having been in government a little bit, is this. There will be people who will snipe at Powell and say, no smoking gun, there's certain evidence that we've heard about that he didn't present, but we're going to be at war in 4 or 6 weeks. And Secretary of State Powell, former General Colin Powell, is not going to risk American lives for the sake of making the French government a little happier. And if we know where a mobile biological weapons lab is through overhead surveillance or through intercepts, and we don't believe the Iraqi government knows that we know that, we're not going to release that information because we want to attack that lab on the first day of the war and save, potentially, a heck of a lot of American and Iraqi lives. So I think you're going to see this government quite properly, this administration, err on the side of caution. They'll release intercepts where it's Iraqi soldiers laughing about how they've hid weapons from the inspectors. They'll release photography that's of sites that the Iraqis know we're photographing. But I don't think people should expect to see a real aha type of information, because that would risk American lives, and I don't think we're going to do that just for the sake of making a couple of European governments happy.
It's my understanding that as late as last night there were still discussions from the two sides in this game about how much to allow out and how much not to. I'm guessing there's a real push by the folks who handle the PR, by the folks who want to influence public opinion, to get a lot out, and the military on the other hand saying, wait just a minute.
and President Bush, I think, making that decision, and he knows we are very, very likely to be at war. And as I say, I do not believe he's going to risk American lives for the sake of, allegedly influencing some of European public opinion.
Jim Engels at the White House. Jim, it's been my sense, at least, that this president had made a decision a long time ago that he's going to do what he believes is best here, no matter what the rest think.
Well, that's right, Shep, and he has said that repeatedly, but clearly the preference is to get as many people in the coalition as possible. The other preference, of course, is to put enough pressure on Saddam Hussein that he might actually turn around. No one expects that to happen. All of those hopes have been dashed repeatedly, so no one really anticipates that Saddam will suddenly get religion here at the 11th hour. But the president has made clear he will go forward if necessary. What Bill was saying about the great care with declassifying intelligence is absolutely true. There was great care in this case, but officials acknowledge that, look, there are times when it is necessary to share some of that intelligence to let the public know what you have. They take great care because, of course, it is through enormous effort and risk that that intelligence is gathered. You do not want to do anything that suggests to the people you're surveilling, in this case the Iraqis, how it is that you're on to them, what it is that you watch for. But as I said a moment ago, there are moments in history, said an official, when it is necessary to use this intelligence. This is clearly one of those moments. But they also caution that there are things that will not be, as Bill suggested, sort of whiz-bang things. For instance, the Secretary of State will use satellite photos today. Satellite photos are usually analyzed by experts who spend hours, days, even weeks going over them, looking at them very carefully and analyzing them. It is not the sort of thing that is immediately obvious to the public, so there will be a good deal of explanation that will go with those today, Shep.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thanks very much. We're going to talk to Bob Baer in just a moment, who's a former CIA operative and who's intimately familiar with the gathering process of this sort of intelligence, both on the ground and from the skies. But first, I want to try and shape the importance of what's going to happen today and put into a little bit of context. And I thought a very quick interview, if you want to call it that our senior correspondent Eric Shawn had with Colin Powell just yesterday told the whole story. Eric Shawn said to Colin Powell, the Iraqis now say that they don't have any weapons of mass destruction and that they have no links to al-Qaeda. And Colin Powell yelled across the car to Eric Shawn, prove it. That's, Eric Shawn, pretty much what all this boils down to. It is not for the United Nations to prove here. It's for Saddam Hussein to prove here.
When they're analyzing this, that it's not up for the inspectors to go out on what the president called a scavenger hunt looking for material. The onus is on Saddam Hussein and Iraq. The onus is not on the inspectors or the Security Council or even the U.S. There basically have been just 4 countries on the 15-member Security Council who completely publicly understand that. Those 4 nations are the U.S., Britain, Bulgaria, and Spain. The 11 other nations have been saying that they want to wait for the inspectors to try and find material, see what the inspectors can dig up and discover, like it's some cat and mouse, game out there in the desert of Iraq. So that is something that is lost, and I think that Secretary Powell will bluntly make the point here yet again, as he did here 2 weeks ago when he was caught off guard by the French foreign minister, that the onus is not on the United Nations, but it is on Iraq to comply and for Iraq to prove that it no longer has any weapons of mass destruction. It is a view also, Shep, that Hans Blix has believed in and has also coincides with saying that it is up to Iraq to cooperate. Blix telling me that he has been unsatisfied with Iraqi cooperation. He has decided in the past not to go back to Baghdad unless they change their attitude, in his words. He is returning at the end of this week one more time for one last visit. Theoretically, he hopes to get those U-2 overflights and the private interviews with scientists. But today here at the World Body, not much hope that Blix will be able to achieve that at all when he returns to Baghdad over this weekend. One final point I want to bring out, and that is that in all the analysis of this, some of these countries really are on the same page, much more than you would think. Diplomatic sources telling me that the Security Council split is not as serious as the media makes it out to be, that you have to remember that even those nations such as Russia, China, and France that do not want military action now have decided and publicly say that the inspectors should be given weeks, if not months. Keep that eye on the term weeks. That's where diplomatic negotiation is concerned. The U.S. says weeks. These nations say weeks. So they do at least have some type of tacit agreement that there will be a few more weeks in this drama, but not much time left after that.
Eric Shawn at the United Nations. Eric, thanks. Our folks at the White House have just been a part of an off-camera briefing. They call it the Daily Gaggle, which happens every morning. And Jim Engel, our senior White House correspondent, just gotten some new information there. Jim, what are you learning?
Well, Shep, what the administration is saying is that the president sees this entire process as one of consultation. This will begin. Powell's presentation this morning will begin an intense round of consultation. In fact, he is scheduled to have 10 meetings just today on this material. This is clearly the kickoff of a campaign to convince nations there that it does not appear that Saddam Hussein is willing to do what he has to do, and if he is not, they have to face the facts. Now, the interesting point here is that Powell is key to this. He is widely respected in international circles. He is the one seen as the one most reluctant to go to war, who was not eager to go to war at the outset. Some other members of the administration are viewed that way by the international community. So Powell has the most credibility of anyone in this administration. When he says that diplomacy and inspections are not working and have no prospect of working, that carries a lot of weight. What they hope to do here is to begin to convince the members of the Security Council that is the case. Diplomatic sources tell us that many nations agree with the U.S. that Iraq must disarm and that it is not yet doing so, but they are not quite to the point, say a number of sources, that they are willing to say it's all off. Even the Germans, who are absolutely opposed to military action, one of their UN representatives said yesterday, Shep, that most of the delegations feel, let's give it another chance before we break it off. Before we break it off. So there is a sense, even among those who are skeptical about military action, that this is moving toward a confrontation, but that there is still a little bit more to be said. They will be listening very closely to what Secretary Powell has to say today, and those who want to change their minds will find plenty in what Powell says to hang their hat on. Shep?
Jim Engel at the White House. Jim, thanks. Bill Kristol, I haven't heard one nation make the argument that they are cooperating, that they are disarming, that they are living up to the letter of the UN resolution.
Well, what they say is let's give the inspectors more time, and that's why this one particular aspect of Powell's presentation is important. If he has really incontrovertible evidence that the Iraqis are subverting the inspections process, let's leave aside whether inspections could work even if in a huge country like Iraq, even if the Iraqis were really cooperating. If the Iraqis have bugged the inspectors' meeting rooms or have penetrated the inspection teams, and before inspectors come somewhere, the Iraqis are moving stuff away, that makes it impossible for the inspections to work. I mean, that by itself, I think, is a total, should be definitive and dispositive, right? I mean, if the Iraqis have nothing to hide, why are they hiding things?
Well, the British reported just the other day that, in fact, they were bugging the conference rooms, that, in fact, they were bugging their cars, that, in fact, they were tape recording their conversations.
In order to move stuff and hide stuff before the inspectors get somewhere. And I think all the Secretary of State has to say is, if they have nothing to hide, why are they hiding things? And those countries who have said, well, let's give the inspections a chance, how can you give the inspectors a chance if the Iraqis are frustrating the inspectors and making it impossible for the inspectors to do their job? So in that respect, I think Powell's presentation and the evidence he will have of Iraqi obstruction of the inspections gives a lot of other nations an excuse, in a sense, to say, okay, the inspections didn't work, we made a good faith effort, and now we can authorize the use of force through the UN Security Council.
From reading Le Monde and some of the rest, it would seem that in France, at least, what the people are looking for is not so much evidence of lack of cooperation and the rest, but what they're looking for is ties to Al-Qaeda. How far can Colin Powell go today in making a link to Al-Qaeda?
Well, there's no question there are links. I don't think he can prove that Iraq was directly involved in September 11th. He can certainly prove that Iraq has links to terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda. That's not necessary for the UN security resolution, which is entirely focused on the weapons of mass destruction issue and Saddam's obligation to disarm. But I think he will also suggest correctly that there are links with terrorists, and that makes Saddam's failure to disarm even more dangerous.
We're just getting a bulletin now from Reuters television news service that the Turkish parliament is to vote on opening bases to the United States troops on February 18th. It sounds on a diplomatic level like we've gotten to a point where that will probably happen, no?
Oh, yeah, I believe it will. The Bush administration, which is so often accused of being heavy-handed and unilateralist, has actually, over the last month or two, been quite adept diplomatically, I would argue. They've got most of the neighboring states on board. Turkey's going to come through. Jordan's okay. The Saudis are now saying that if the UN Security Council authorizes it, they'll be okay with us using their bases, if not for attacking, at least for reconnaissance and other things. I think this presentation will give, as I say, a lot of the members of the Security Council a chance to come on board. I think you might end up with quite a huge coalition behind the U.S. in this effort.
20 minutes past 6 o'clock, I believe, right now in Baghdad, excuse me, where Iraqi officials, as you see on the left-hand side of your screen there, are gathered around a television set watching this. This UN speech to be broadcast to more than 100 countries, it's my understanding, and probably officials from every nation on the planet will be watching today. Jim Engel at the White House, I know that the administration is well aware of more than the facts of this message, of today's speech, the message that's sent out, the tone of it. They want to put forward a statement today that says, "We're through playing."
That's right, Shep. What they want to demonstrate flatly here is not just that the Iraqis are not cooperating, but that the Iraqis have no intention of cooperating. As Bill said a moment ago, the question keeps being asked, why not give the inspectors more time? And it is probably true that the inspectors would, over time, find an odd missile warhead here and there, as they did yesterday, but that is not the point in the U.S. view. The point is Iraq has to cooperate under Resolution 1441. There is no indication they're going to cooperate, so American officials ask, and Secretary Powell will make the case that, what more time do we need? How much more time does Iraq need to decide that it must cooperate? That is the key question that Powell has been trying to raise with the Security Council. It is not a question of how much more time the inspectors need. It is a question of how much more time Iraq needs to actually make the decision that it must cooperate with the arms inspectors. And Powell will make a compelling case, American officials say today, that Iraq has made no such decision, and in fact, all of the evidence points to the fact that they have no intention of cooperating, that they have, in fact, created an elaborate organization to deceive the inspectors, to hide weapons of mass destruction, to do everything they can not to cooperate with the arms inspectors.
It would appear, at least at this point, that the case has been made domestically, Bill Crystal. A new Fox News Opinion Dynamics poll out today shows that 87% of Americans believe that he has weapons of mass destruction. 81% of Americans believe that Iraq has ties to al-Qaeda. 67% of Americans support the disarming and the removal of Saddam Hussein. These are numbers that many believed about 3-4 weeks ago might go the other way. Instead, they've gone up.
Well, the president did an awfully good job in the State of the Union address, which was watched by tens of millions of Americans. I think a lot of people will watch Secretary Powell today, or certainly watch highlights of it tonight, and that will help. People do believe correctly. Look, he does have weapons of mass destruction. I mean, no one seriously doubts it. The UN found them throughout the 90s. The UN report in 1998 said there were huge numbers still unaccounted for. Defectors say he has them, and there are defectors who've actually worked on them. He has the weapons. He's not in compliance. You could say all of that and still say, well, it's another thing to go to war. And that's why I think it's important for the president and the administration to keep this effort up in terms of convincing people that this is the only choice. The time really has run out, because an awful lot of people of goodwill might say, well, Saddam's horrible, he has these weapons, but maybe we could let diplomacy work a little better. But if Saddam is absolutely refusing to cooperate in any way, what's the point of letting things get more dangerous as time goes on?
Isn't it very difficult, even for nations where they will do anything to avoid war, like Germany, isn't it difficult to make a case when we know that they won't let the plane fly over, which they did have during the previous inspections, when they won't even let us interview the scientists, which was at the core of the UN resolution saying it was of the utmost importance?
Well, the German case ultimately is it doesn't matter. If he has these weapons of mass destruction, we can deter him. He doesn't want to let his country be annihilated. And so too bad, he's a bad guy, he has these weapons, we can live with it. That is not this administration's view, it's not most Americans' view. After September 11th, that was the most important sentence in President Bush's State of the Union speech, that we cannot assume that we can contain a state, a regime like Saddam Hussein, because what happens if you wake up one day and you fail to contain him? We will not risk 9/11 with chemical or biological or nuclear weapons. And on that, I think some of the Europeans just don't want to face up to that. They don't want to face up to how dangerous the situation will be in 5 or 10 years from now if we don't act today. But I think the president has certainly brought American public opinion along. He's brought public opinion. He's bringing public opinion along in the friendlier European countries. And I think ultimately he'll have a pretty, as I say, a pretty large coalition behind him here as we move to disarm Saddam.
A smiling Colin Powell on the screen at 25 minutes past 10 o'clock here in New York. George Tenet was there just a moment ago as well. Hans Blix now. Powell, Tenet, all the rest. You've been behind the scenes before enormous meetings like this. What has it been like at the White House and in inner circles over the last couple of days?
You know, I'm not sure I've been quite in the most innermost circles at that level. Oh, look, it's been very intense, and I suspect the president has made some personal decisions about what can and can't be released, as we were discussing earlier. And as I say, I wouldn't minimize. I know they want to make a great public relations effort, but they are not going to put American lives at risk just to make a good splashy demonstration. And one really shouldn't underestimate the importance of some of this intelligence, especially if we know where some of the biological and chemical weapons are, especially if we're tracking some of the mobile units. I don't think we want the Iraqis to know how much we know about that. So I think you'll see Powell maybe make some general statements about that without revealing detailed intelligence. War, you know, this president, I think, is very serious about the use of American force and the loss of American lives and Iraqi lives, incidentally. And he's not going to risk that for the sake of a slightly glitzier presentation.
Jim Engel, Bill mentions that the president most likely made a number of these decisions personally. We've learned in writing since 9/11 how many of the enormous decisions were made specifically by him. We're talking about a president who many thought before might be one who did a lot of listening and didn't make a lot of decisions. We've learned that, in fact, that's not the case. How closely involved was he during this process with the top decision making?
Yeah, that view of the president not being in control of his own administration has evaporated long since, Shep. He was involved. The National Security Council was in charge of this declassification process, obviously working interagency with the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, which is responsible for signals, intelligence, communications intercepts, and all of the rest of the intelligence community. They have been working night and day on this effort, weighing very carefully what could be and what could not be declassified, what kinds of hints we might give the Iraqis of how we knew what they were up to. One official told me this morning, for instance, that as we show satellite photographs, there are reasons that we pick some photographs and not others, reasons that we are interested in a particular place. That is because there are certain signals the Iraqis give off when they are up to no good. If we say anything about those signals, about the signature that led us to take interest in these particular photographs, the Iraqis would then know about that and could change the way they do business. So there are things you have to do, even as you declassify things. You have to be very careful not to tell more than you need to. Obviously, the administration wants to make as powerful and compelling a case as it can. This is the critical moment in this debate, a point at which all of the world and all of the Security Council in particular will be watching, a point at which Powell's arguments can turn the day. So it is critical that they make a compelling presentation, that they offer the best evidence they have without going too far and telling the Iraqis what they know. It is clear that as you get closer to a decision to go to war, it is less important to protect that intelligence because some of it will evaporate as you move to military action anyway. But clearly there are lives at stake. When you use signals intelligence, communications intercepts, they know what you were able to hear. When you use satellite photos, they know what you're able to see and realize how better to hide their weapons programs. When you use human intelligence, they may be able to figure out who it is, and those people turn up dead. In fact, Saddam has a reputation for killing any number of people just because he suspects there may be someone in that group. So they have to be very careful, but this is a critical moment. This is a historical moment in which the administration has taken a great deal of care to put together the most compelling case it can without jeopardizing the sources of intelligence.
Bob Baer is a former CIA operative who's been involved in this collection process over the years. Bob, Jim's point is well taken here. They want to give enough, but they can't give too much. How much danger can that be?
There's a lot of sources and methods that they definitely don't want to compromise, and they can't compromise, especially if we're going to go to a war, so they can't include the whole package. They need to take some highlights and make a compelling picture by showing this fabric of deception, which we all know occurs. And this is really a very important public relations, it's a necessary public relations effort to convince the American people and the Europeans that this guy remains a danger and isn't going to go away. But in fact, they're telling the French and the Germans that he's a lot worse than the evidence we're presenting.
No, I think that's right, Shep. You know, this president remembers that bin Laden was able to carry out 9/11 because he discovered, because of American carelessness, that we were able to monitor his cell phone conversations a couple of years ago. He changed his mode of communicating among his subordinates, and they had pretty good security, unfortunately, before September 11th. And then he may well have gotten away in November in Afghanistan, again, because he realized what we were able to do, was able to change his pattern of operation. So I think we're going to be very careful on that. The other point I would make, picking up on what Jim said, Steve Hadley, Condi Rice's deputy at the National Security Council, who's in the White House, coordinated the interagency process between the Defense Department, CIA, our spy agents, the National Security Agency, the State Department, etc. Steve Hadley works directly for Condi Rice, for Condoleezza Rice. Condoleezza Rice obviously works directly for the president. This was run out of the White House. This was very sensitive. The key decisions were made in the White House. Obviously, Secretary of State Powell, I'm sure, shaped the presentation of the evidence. But again, I would say it's not just that you don't want to compromise your sources and methods, as they say in the intelligence business. If we know something that we need to hit on the first day of the war, we very much don't want the Iraqis to know what we know.
Colin Powell on the screen now, blowing a kiss to his fans across the room, it would appear. Mohammed al-Baradei and Hans Blix there just a moment ago, speaking with the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan. And Jim Engel at the White House, there was a time not so long ago where it seemed at least that Hans Blix was viewed as not so friendly toward the United States and the administration's position. Over time, that seems to have changed, and he's come around to agree in principle, it would appear, at least with the administration. How did that happen?
Well, he's tried to take a neutral position, as he must, Shep, but the fact is, as he looks at the facts, he often comes to the same conclusions the U.S. reaches when it looks at the facts. Everyone knows what the Iraqis are up to. Blix, pardon me, Blix is on the front end of that. He experiences that deception more than anyone else. I think it's interesting, too, to note here, Shep, as you see Secretary Powell passing through that room here over the last few minutes, what a celebrity he is, and I think it's fair to use that term even in the international community. As you see people come up hugging him, shaking his hand, coming up to greet him. This man has a great deal of credibility. His presentation today could change the views of lots of these nations, or at least give them something they can point to as they begin to shift their view of what is necessary in dealing with Saddam Hussein.
All right, Jim Engel at the White House. He'll be with us for analysis on the back, as will Bill Kristol and Bob Baer. We'll also be speaking with our Washington managing editor, Britt Hume, when all of this is over. To say a historic moment is one that we're about to witness is maybe to understate the case. I'm watching on another monitor here as we look live in Baghdad as officials are gathered around an enormous conference table and watching on a television. Joschka Fischer now, the German foreign minister, to introduce Colin Powell.
The meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is before the Council in document as Agenda 4701, which reads, quote, "The situation between Iraq and Kuwait," end of quote. Unless I hear any objection, I shall consider the agenda adopted. The agenda is adopted. I should like to inform the Council that I have received a letter from the representative of Iraq in which he requests to be invited to participate in the discussion of the item on the Council's agenda. In accordance with the usual practice, I propose, with the consent of the Council, to invite that representative to participate in the discussion without the right to vote, in accordance with the relevant provisions of the Charter and Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedures. There being no objection, it is so decided. I invite the representative of Iraq to take a seat at the Council table. I welcome the presence of the distinguished Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Kofi Annan, at this meeting. I also welcome the presence of Dr. Hans Blix, Executive Chairman of the United Nations Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission, and Dr. Mohammed El-Baradei, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Members of the Council who wish to address questions to Dr. Blix and Dr. El-Baradei are invited to do so at the luncheon to be held following the adjournment of this meeting. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. The purpose of this meeting is to hear a presentation by the United States. In order for us to work within our timetable, participants are urged to speak for not more than 7 minutes. I call now on the distinguished Secretary of State of the United States of America, His Excellency, Mr. Colin Powell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished colleagues, I would like to begin by expressing my thanks for the special effort that each of you made to be here today. This is an important day for us all as we review the situation with respect to Iraq and its disarmament obligations under UN Security Council Resolution 1441. Last November 8th, this Council passed Resolution 1441 by a unanimous vote. The purpose of that resolution was to disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. Iraq had already been found guilty of material breach of its obligations stretching back over 16 previous resolutions and 12 years. Resolution 1441 was not dealing with an innocent party, but a regime this Council has repeatedly convicted over the years. Resolution 1441 gave Iraq one last chance to come into compliance or to face serious consequences. No Council member present and voting on that day had any illusions about the nature and intent of the resolution or what serious consequences meant if Iraq did not comply. And to assist in its disarmament, we called on Iraq to cooperate with returning inspectors from UNMOVIC and IAEA. We laid down tough standards for Iraq to meet to allow the inspectors to do their job. This Council placed the burden on Iraq to comply and disarm, and not on the inspectors to find that which Iraq has gone out of its way to conceal for so long. Inspectors are inspectors. They are not detectives. I asked for this session today for two purposes. First, to support the core assessments made by Dr. Blix and Dr. El-Baradei. As Dr. Blix reported to this Council on January 27th, quote, Iraq appears not to have come to a genuine acceptance, not even today, of the disarmament which was demanded of it, unquote. And as Dr. El-Baradei reported, Iraq's declaration of December 7th, quote, did not provide any new information relevant to certain questions that have been outstanding since 1998. My second purpose today is to provide you with additional information to share with you what the United States knows about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, as well as Iraq's involvement in terrorism, which is also the subject of Resolution 1441 and other earlier resolutions. I might add at this point that we are providing all relevant information we can to the inspection teams for them to do their work. The material I will present to you comes from a variety of sources. Some are U.S. sources and some are those of other countries. Some of the sources are technical, such as intercepted telephone conversations and photos taken by satellites. Other sources are people who have risked their lives to let the world know what Saddam Hussein is really up to. I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. Let me begin by playing a tape for you. What you're about to hear is a conversation that my government monitored. It takes place on November 26th of last year, on the day before United Nations teams resumed inspections in Iraq. The conversation involves two senior officers, a colonel and a brigadier general from Iraq's elite military unit, the Republican Guard. Let me pause and review some of the key elements of this conversation that you've just heard between these two officers. First, they acknowledge that our colleague Mohammed al-Baradei is coming, and they know what he's coming for, and they know he's coming the next day. He's coming to look for things that are prohibited. He is expecting these gentlemen to cooperate with them and not hide things. But they're worried. We have this modified vehicle. What do we say if one of them sees it? What is their concern? Their concern is that it's something they should not have, something that should not be seen. The general is incredulous. You didn't get a modified. You don't have one of those, do you? I have one. Which? From where? From the workshop. From the Al-Kindi company. What? From Al-Kindi. I'll come to see you in the morning. I'm worried you all have something left. We evacuated everything. We don't have anything left. Note what he says. We evacuated everything. We didn't destroy it. We didn't line it up for inspection. We didn't turn it into the inspectors. We evacuated it to make sure it was not around when the inspectors showed up. I will come to you tomorrow. The Al-Kindi company. This is a company that is well known to have been involved in prohibited weapons systems activity. Let me play another tape for you. As you'll recall, the inspectors found 12 empty chemical warheads on January 16th. On January 20th, 4 days later, Iraq promised the inspectors it would search for more. You will now hear an officer from Republican Guard headquarters issuing an instruction to an officer in the field. Their conversation took place just last week on January 30th.
سيدي العزيز نعم توجيه السيد رئيس أركان الحرس اليوم بالمؤتمر نعم تفتشون الاعتداء اللي عندكم نعم لاحتمال وجود عتاد محظور نعم لاحتمال وجود عتاد محظور بطريقة الصدفة نعم ودزينا لكم كتاب بتفتيش مناطق الاستقراب والمناطق المتروكة نعم هذا بعد ما نفذتوا مضمونه اتلفوا الكتاب يعني ما اريد احد يشوف هذا الكتاب ماشي
Let me pause again and review the elements of this message. They're inspecting the ammunition you have. Yes, yes. For the possibility there are forbidden ammo. For the possibility there is by chance forbidden ammo, yes. And we sent you a message yesterday to clean out all of the areas, the scrap areas, the abandoned areas, make sure there is nothing there. Remember the first message, evacuate it. This is all part of a system of hiding things and moving things out of the way and making sure they have left nothing behind. You go a little further into this message and you see the specific instructions from headquarters. After you have carried out what is contained in this message, destroy the message, because I don't want anyone to see this message. Okay. Why? This message would have verified to the inspectors that they have been trying to turn over things. They were looking for things, but they don't want that message seen because they were trying to clean up the area to leave no evidence behind of the presence of weapons of mass destruction. And they can claim that nothing was there, and the inspectors can look all they want and they will find nothing. This effort to hide things from the inspectors is not one or two isolated events. Quite the contrary. This is part and parcel of a policy of evasion and deception that goes back 12 years, a policy set at the highest levels of the Iraqi regime. We know that Saddam Hussein has what is called, quote, a higher committee for monitoring the inspection teams, unquote. Think about that. Iraq has a high-level committee to monitor the inspectors who were sent in to monitor Iraq's disarmament, not to cooperate with them, not to assist them, but to spy on them and to keep them from doing their jobs. The committee reports directly to Saddam Hussein. It is headed by Iraq's Vice President, Taha Yassin Ramadan. Its members include Saddam Hussein's son, Qusay. This committee also includes Lieutenant General Amir al-Sadi, an advisor to Saddam. In case that name isn't immediately familiar to you, General Sadi has been the Iraqi regime's primary point of contact for Dr. Blix and Dr. al-Baradei. It was General Sadi who last fall publicly pledged that Iraq was prepared to cooperate unconditionally with inspectors. Quite the contrary. Sadi's job is not to cooperate. It is to deceive, not to disarm, but to undermine the inspectors, not to support them, but to frustrate them and to make sure they learn nothing. We have learned a lot about the work of this special committee. We learned that just prior to the return of inspectors last November, the regime has decided to resume what we heard called, quote, the old game of cat and mouse, unquote. For example, let me focus on the now famous declaration that Iraq submitted to this council on December 7th. Iraq never had any intention of complying with this council's mandate. Instead, Iraq planned to use the declaration to overwhelm us and to overwhelm the inspectors with useless information about Iraq's permitted weapons so that we would not have time to pursue Iraq's prohibited weapons. Iraq's goal was to give us in this room, to give those of us on this council, the false impression that the inspection process was working. You saw the result. Dr. Blix pronounced the 12,200-page declaration rich in volume, but poor in information and practically devoid of new evidence. Could any member of this council honestly rise in defense of this false declaration? Everything we have seen and heard indicates that instead of cooperating actively with the inspectors to ensure the success of their mission, Saddam Hussein and his regime are busy doing all they possibly can to ensure that inspectors succeed in finding absolutely nothing. My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. I will cite some examples, and these are from human sources. Orders were issued to Iraq's security organizations as well as to Saddam Hussein's own office to hide all correspondence with the Organization of Military Industrialization. This is the organization that oversees Iraq's weapons of mass destruction activities. Make sure there are no documents left which would connect you to the OMI. We know that Saddam's son Qusay ordered the removal of all prohibited weapons from Saddam's numerous palace complexes. We know that Iraqi government officials, members of the ruling Ba'ath Party, and scientists have hidden prohibited items in their homes. Other key files from military and scientific establishments have been placed in cars that are being driven around the countryside by Iraqi intelligence agents to avoid detection. Thanks to intelligence they were provided, the inspectors recently found dramatic confirmation of these reports. When they searched the home of an Iraqi nuclear scientist, they uncovered roughly 2,000 pages of documents. You see them here being brought out of the home and placed in UN hands. Some of the material is classified and related to Iraq's nuclear program. Tell me, answer me, are the inspectors to search the house of every government official, every Ba'ath Party member, and every scientist in the country to find the truth, to get the information they need to satisfy the demands of our council? Our sources tell us that in some cases, the hard drives of computers at Iraqi weapons facilities were replaced. Who took the hard drives? Where did they go? What's being hidden? Why? There's only one answer to the why: to deceive, to hide, to keep from the inspectors. Numerous human sources tell us that the Iraqis are moving not just documents and hard drives, but weapons of mass destruction to keep them from being found by inspectors. While we were here in this council chamber debating Resolution 1441 last fall, we know from sources that a missile brigade outside Baghdad was dispersing rocket launchers and warheads containing biological warfare agent to various locations, distributing them to various locations in western Iraq. Most of the launchers and warheads had been hidden in large groves of palm trees and were to be moved every 1 to 4 weeks to escape detection. We also have satellite photos that indicate that banned materials have recently been moved from a number of Iraqi weapons of mass destruction facilities. Let me say a word about satellite images before I show a couple. The photos that I am about to show you are sometimes hard for the average person to interpret, hard for me. The painstaking work of photo analysis takes experts with years and years of experience, poring for hours and hours over light tables. But as I show you these images, I will try to capture and explain what they mean, what they indicate to our imagery specialists. Let's look at one. This one is about a weapons munition facility, a facility that holds ammunition at a place called Taji. This is one of about 65 such facilities in Iraq. We know that this one has housed chemical munitions. In fact, this is where the Iraqis recently came up with the additional 4 chemical weapon shells. Here you see 15 munitions bunkers in yellow and red outlines. The 4 that are in red squares represent active chemical munitions bunkers. How do I know that? How can I say that? Let me give you a closer look. Look at the image on the left. On the left is a close-up of one of the 4 chemical bunkers. The 2 arrows indicate the presence of sure signs that the bunkers are storing chemical munitions. The arrow at the top that says security points to a facility that is a signature item for this kind of bunker. Inside that facility are special guards and special equipment to monitor any leakage that might come out of the bunker. The truck you also see is a signature item. It's a decontamination vehicle in case something goes wrong. This is characteristic of those 4 bunkers. The special security facility and the decontamination vehicle will be in the area. If not at any one of them or one of the other, it is moving around those 4, and it moves as it needed to move as people are working in the different bunkers. Now look at the picture on the right. You are now looking at 2 of those sanitized bunkers. The signature vehicles are gone. The tents are gone. It's been cleaned up, and it was done on the 22nd of December as the UN inspection team is arriving, and you can see the inspection vehicles arriving in the lower portion of the picture on the right. The bunkers are clean when the inspectors get there. They found nothing. This sequence of events raises the worrisome suspicion that Iraq had been tipped off to the forthcoming inspections at Taji. As it did throughout the 1990s, we know that Iraq today is actively using its considerable intelligence capabilities to hide its illicit activities. From our sources, we know that inspectors are under constant surveillance by an army of Iraqi intelligence operatives. Iraq is relentlessly attempting to tap all of their communications, both voice and electronics. I would call my colleagues' attention to the fine paper that the United Kingdom distributed yesterday, which describes in exquisite detail Iraqi deception activities. In this next example, you will see the type of concealment activity Iraq has undertaken in response to the resumption of inspections. Indeed, in November 2002, just when the inspections were about to resume, this type of activity spiked. Here are 3 examples. At this ballistic missile site on November 10th, we saw a cargo truck preparing to move ballistic missile components. At this biological weapons-related facility on November 25th, just 2 days before inspections resumed, this truck caravan appeared, something we almost never see at this facility, and we monitor it carefully and regularly. At this ballistic missile facility, again, 2 days before inspections began, 5 large cargo trucks appeared, along with the truck-mounted crane to move missiles. We saw this kind of house cleaning at close to 30 sites. Days after this activity, the vehicles and the equipment that I've just highlighted disappear, and the site returns to patterns of normalcy. We don't know precisely what Iraq was moving, but the inspectors already knew about these sites, so Iraq knew that they would be coming. We must ask ourselves, why would Iraq suddenly move equipment of this nature before inspections if they were anxious to demonstrate what they had or did not have? Remember the first intercept in which 2 Iraqis talked about the need to hide a modified vehicle from the inspectors. Where did Iraq take all of this equipment? Why wasn't it presented to the inspectors? Iraq also has refused to permit any U-2 reconnaissance flights that would give the inspectors a better sense of what's being moved before, during, and after inspections. This refusal to allow this kind of reconnaissance is in direct, specific violation of operative paragraph 7 of our resolution 1441. Saddam Hussein and his regime are not just trying to conceal weapons, they're also trying to hide people. You know the basic facts. Iraq has not complied with its obligation to allow immediate, unimpeded, unrestricted, and private access to all officials and other persons as required by Resolution 1441. The regime only allows interviews with inspectors in the presence of an Iraqi official, a minder. The official Iraqi organization charged with facilitating inspections announced publicly and announced ominously that, quote, nobody is ready to leave Iraq to be interviewed. Iraqi Vice President Ramadan accused the inspectors of conducting espionage, a veiled threat that anyone cooperating with UN inspectors was committing treason. Iraq did not meet its obligations under 1441 to provide a comprehensive list of scientists associated with its weapons of mass destruction programs. Iraq's list was out of date and contained only about 500 names, despite the fact that UNSCOM had earlier put together a list of about 3,500 names. Let me just tell you what a number of human sources have told us. Saddam Hussein has directly participated in the effort to prevent interviews. In early December, Saddam Hussein had all Iraqi scientists warned of the serious consequences that they and their families would face if they revealed any sensitive information to the inspectors. They were forced to sign documents acknowledging that divulging information is punishable by death. Saddam Hussein also said that scientists should be told not to agree to leave Iraq. Anyone who agreed to be interviewed outside Iraq would be treated as a spy. This violates 1441. In mid-November, just before the inspectors returned, Iraqi experts were ordered to report to the headquarters of the Special Security Organization to receive counterintelligence training. The training focused on evasion methods, interrogation resistance techniques, and how to mislead inspectors. Ladies and gentlemen, these are not assertions. These are facts corroborated by many sources, some of them sources of the intelligence services of other countries. For example, in mid-December, weapons experts at one facility were replaced by Iraqi intelligence agents who were to deceive inspectors about the work that was being done there. On orders from Saddam Hussein, Iraqi officials issued a false death certificate for one scientist, and he was sent into hiding. In the middle of January, experts at one facility that was related to weapons of mass destruction, those experts had been ordered to stay home from work to avoid the inspectors. Workers from other Iraqi military facilities not engaged in illicit weapons projects were to replace the workers who'd been sent home. A dozen experts have been placed under house arrest, not in their own houses, but as a group at one of Saddam Hussein's guest houses. It goes on and on and on. As the examples I have just presented show, the information and intelligence we have gathered point to an active and systematic effort on the part of the Iraqi regime to keep key materials and people from the inspectors in direct violation of Resolution 1441. The pattern is not just one of reluctant cooperation, nor is it merely a lack of cooperation. What we see is a deliberate campaign to prevent any meaningful inspection work. My colleagues, operative paragraph 4 of UN Resolution 1441, which we lingered over so long last fall, clearly states that false statements and omissions in the declaration and a failure by Iraq at any time to comply with and cooperate fully in the implementation of this resolution shall constitute, the facts speak for themselves, shall constitute a further material breach of its obligation. We wrote it this way to give Iraq an early test. To give Iraq an early test. Would they give an honest declaration, and would they early on indicate a willingness to cooperate with the inspectors? It was designed to be an early test. They failed that test. By this standard, the standard of this operative paragraph, I believe that Iraq is now in further material breach of its obligations. I believe this conclusion is irrefutable and undeniable. Iraq has now placed itself in danger of the serious consequences called for in UN Resolution 1441. And this body places itself in danger of irrelevance if it allows Iraq to continue to defy its will without responding effectively and immediately. The issue before us is not how much time we are willing to give the inspectors to be frustrated by Iraqi obstruction, but how much longer are we willing to put up with Iraq's noncompliance before we, as a council, we, as the United Nations, say, enough, enough. The gravity of this moment is matched by the gravity of the threat that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction pose to the world. Let me now turn to those deadly weapons programs and describe why they are real and present dangers to the region and to the world. First, biological weapons. We have talked frequently here about biological weapons. By way of introduction and history, I think there are just 3 quick points I need to make. First, you will recall that it took UNSCOM 4 long and frustrating years to pry an admission out of Iraq that it had biological weapons. Second, when Iraq finally admitted having these weapons in 1995, the quantities were vast. Less than a teaspoon of dry anthrax, a little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of a teaspoon. Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001. This forced several hundred people to undergo emergency medical treatment and killed 2 postal workers just from an amount just about this quantity that was inside of an envelope. Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters. If concentrated into this dry form, this amount would be enough to fill tens upon tens of thousands of teaspoons. And Saddam Hussein has not verifiably accounted for even 1 teaspoonful of this deadly material. And that is my third point, and it is key. The Iraqis have never accounted for all of the biological weapons they admitted they had, and we know they had. They have never accounted for all the organic material used to make them, and they have not accounted for many of the weapons filled with these agents, such as their R-400 bombs. This is evidence, not conjecture. This is true. This is all well documented. Dr. Blix told this council that Iraq has provided little evidence to verify anthrax production and no convincing evidence of its destruction. It should come as no shock, then, that since Saddam Hussein forced out the last inspectors in 1998, we have amassed much intelligence indicating that Iraq is continuing to make these weapons. One of the most worrisome things that emerges from the thick intelligence file we have on Iraq's biological weapons is the existence of mobile production facilities used to make biological agents. Let me take you inside that intelligence file and share with you what we know from eyewitness accounts. We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails. The trucks and train cars are easily moved and are designed to evade detection by inspectors. In a matter of months, they can produce a quantity of biological poison equal to the entire amount that Iraq claimed to have produced in the years prior to the Gulf War. Although Iraq's mobile production program began in the mid-1990s, UN inspectors at the time only had vague hints of such programs. Confirmation came later, in the year 2000. The source was an eyewitness, an Iraqi chemical engineer who supervised one of these facilities. He actually was present during biological agent production runs. He was also at the site when an accident occurred in 1998. 12 technicians died from exposure to biological agents. He reported that when UNSCOM was in country and inspecting, the biological weapons agent production always began on Thursdays at midnight because Iraq thought UNSCOM would not inspect on the Muslim holy day, Thursday night through Friday. He added that this was important because the units could not be broken down in the middle of a production run, which had to be completed by Friday evening before the inspectors might arrive again. This defector is currently hiding in another country with a certain knowledge that Saddam Hussein will kill him if he finds him. His eyewitness account of these mobile production facilities has been corroborated by other sources. A second source, an Iraqi civil engineer in a position to know the details of the program, confirmed the existence of transportable facilities moving on trailers. A third source, also in a position to know, reported in summer 2002 that Iraq had manufactured mobile production systems mounted on road trailer units and on rail cars. Finally, a fourth source, an Iraqi major who defected, confirmed that Iraq has mobile biological research laboratories in addition to the production facilities I mentioned earlier. We have diagrammed what our sources reported about these mobile facilities. Here you see both truck and rail car mounted mobile factories. The description our sources gave us of the technical features required by such facilities are highly detailed and extremely accurate. As these drawings, based on their description, show, we know what the fermenters look like. We know what the tanks, pumps, compressors, and other parts look like. We know how they fit together. We know how they work. And we know a great deal about the platforms on which they are mounted. As shown in this diagram, these factories can be concealed easily, either by moving ordinary-looking trucks and rail cars along Iraq's thousands of miles of highway or track, or by parking them in a garage or a warehouse or somewhere in Iraq's extensive system of underground tunnels and bunkers. We know that Iraq has at least 7 of these mobile biological agent factories. The truck-mounted ones have at least 2 or 3 trucks each. That means that the mobile production facilities are very few, perhaps 18 trucks that we know of. There may be more, but perhaps 18 that we know of. Just imagine trying to find 18 trucks among the thousands and thousands of trucks that travel the roads of Iraq every single day. It took the inspectors 4 years to find out that Iraq was making biological agents. How long do you think it will take the inspectors to find even one of these 18 trucks without Iraq coming forward, as they are supposed to, with the information about these kinds of capabilities. Ladies and gentlemen, these are sophisticated facilities. For example, they can produce anthrax and botulinum toxin. In fact, they can produce enough dry biological agent in a single month to kill thousands upon thousands of people. And dry agent of this type is the most lethal form for human beings. By 1998, UN experts agreed that the Iraqis had perfected drying techniques for their biological weapons programs. Now, Iraq has incorporated this drying expertise into these mobile production facilities. We know from Iraq's past admissions that it has successfully weaponized not only anthrax, but also other biological agents, including botulinum toxin, aflatoxin, and ricin. But Iraq's research efforts did not stop there. Saddam Hussein has investigated dozens of biological agents, causing diseases such as gas gangrene, plague, typhus, tetanus, cholera, camelpox, and hemorrhagic fever. And he also has the wherewithal to develop smallpox. The Iraqi regime has also developed ways to disperse lethal biological agents widely, indiscriminately, into the water supply, into the air. For example, Iraq had a program to modify aerial fuel tanks for Mirage jets. This video of an Iraqi test flight obtained by UNSCOM some years ago shows an Iraqi F-1 Mirage jet aircraft. Note the spray coming from beneath the Mirage. That is 2,000 liters of simulated anthrax that a jet is spraying. In 1995, an Iraqi military officer, Mujahid Saleh Abdul Latif, told inspectors that Iraq intended the spray tanks to be mounted onto a MiG-21 that had been converted into an unmanned aerial vehicle, or a UAV. UAVs outfitted with spray tanks constitute an ideal method for launching a terrorist attack using biological weapons. Iraq admitted to producing 4 spray tanks, but to this day, it has provided no credible evidence that they were destroyed, evidence that was required by the international community. There can be no doubt that Saddam Hussein has biological weapons and the capability to rapidly produce more, many more. And he has the ability to dispense these lethal poisons and diseases in ways that can cause massive death and destruction. If biological weapons seem too terrible to contemplate, chemical weapons are equally chilling. UNMOVIC already laid out much of this, and it is documented for all of us to read in UNSCOM's 1999 report on the subject. Let me set the stage with 3 key points that all of us need to keep in mind. First, Saddam Hussein has used these horrific weapons on another country and on his own people. In fact, in the history of chemical warfare, no country has had more battlefield experience with chemical weapons since World War I than Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Second, as with biological weapons, Saddam Hussein has never accounted for vast amounts of chemical weaponry. 550 artillery shells with mustard, 30,000 empty munitions, and enough precursors to increase his stockpile to as much as 500 tons of chemical agents. If we consider just one category of missing weaponry, 6,500 bombs from the Iran-Iraq War, UNMOVIC says the amount of chemical agent in them would be on the order of 1,000 tons. These quantities of chemical weapons are now unaccounted for. Dr. Blick says, quipped that, quote, mustard gas is not marmalade. You are supposed to know what you did with it. We believe Saddam Hussein knows what he did with it, and he has not come clean with the international community. We have evidence these weapons existed. What we don't have is evidence from Iraq that they have been destroyed or where they are. That is what we are still waiting for. Third point, Iraq's record on chemical weapons is replete with lies. It took years for Iraq to finally admit that it had produced 4 tons of the deadly nerve agent VX. A single drop of VX on the skin will kill in minutes. 4 tons. The admission only came out after inspectors collected documentation as a result of the defection of Hussein Kamal, Saddam Hussein's late son-in-law. UNSCOM also gained forensic evidence that Iraq had produced VX and put it into weapons for delivery. Yet to this day, Iraq denies it had ever weaponized VX. And on January 27th, UNMOVIC told this council that it has information that conflicts with the Iraqi account of its VX program. We know that Iraq has embedded key portions of its illicit chemical weapons infrastructure within its legitimate civilian industry. To all outward appearances, even to experts, the infrastructure looks like an ordinary civilian operation. Illicit and legitimate production can go on simultaneously, or on a dime. This dual-use infrastructure can turn from clandestine to commercial and then back again. These inspections would be unlikely, any inspections of such facilities would be unlikely to turn up anything prohibited, especially if there is any warning that the inspections are coming. Call it ingenious or evil genius, but the Iraqis deliberately designed their chemical weapons programs to be inspected. It is infrastructure with a built-in ally. Under the guise of dual-use infrastructure, Iraq has undertaken an effort to reconstitute facilities that were closely associated with its past program to develop and produce chemical weapons. For example, Iraq has rebuilt key portions of the Tariq state establishment. Tariq includes facilities designed specifically for Iraq's chemical weapons program and employs key figures from past programs. That's the production end of Saddam's chemical weapons business. What about the delivery end? I'm going to show you a small part of a chemical complex called Al-Musayyib, a site that Iraq has used for at least 3 years to transship chemical weapons from production facilities out to the field. In May 2002, our satellites photographed the unusual activity in this picture. Here we see cargo vehicles are again at this transshipment point, and we can see that they are accompanied by a decontamination vehicle associated with biological or chemical weapons activity. What makes this picture significant is that we have a human source who has corroborated that movement of chemical weapons occurred at this site at that time. So it's not just the photo, and it's not an individual seeing the photo. It's the photo and the knowledge of an individual being brought together to make the case. This photograph of the site, taken 2 months later in July, shows not only the previous site, which is the figure in the middle at the top with the bulldozer sign near it. It shows that this previous site, as well as all of the other sites around the site, have been fully bulldozed and graded. The topsoil has been removed. The Iraqis literally removed the crust of the earth from large portions of this site in order to conceal chemical weapons evidence that would be there from years of chemical weapons activity. To support its deadly biological and chemical weapons programs, Iraq procures needed items from around the world using an extensive clandestine network. What we know comes largely from intercepted communications and human sources who are in a position to know the facts. Iraq's procurement efforts include equipment that can filter and separate microorganisms and toxins involved in biological weapons, equipment that can be used to concentrate the agent, growth media that can be used to continue producing anthrax and botulinum toxin, sterilization equipment for laboratories, glass-lined reactors and specialty pumps that can handle corrosive chemical weapons agents and precursors, large amounts of thionyl chloride, a precursor for nerve and blister agents, and other chemicals such as sodium sulfide, an important mustard agent precursor. Now, of course, Iraq will argue that these items can also be used for legitimate purposes. But if that is true, why do we have to learn about them by intercepting communications and risking the lives of human agents? With Iraq's well-documented history on biological and chemical weapons, why should any of us give Iraq the benefit of the doubt? I don't, and I don't think you will either after you hear this next intercept. Just a few weeks ago, we intercepted communications between two commanders in Iraq's 2nd Republican Guard Corps. One commander is going to be giving an instruction to the other. You will hear as this unfolds that what he wants to communicate to the other guy He wants to make sure the other guy hears clearly, to the point of repeating it so that it gets written down and completely understood. Listen.
الو الو تفضل سيدي. الو ابي ابراهيم سيدي. ابراهيم شلونك؟ الله يسلمك سيدي. شلون صرتك؟ الله يحفظك. شلون اخبارك؟ خير الحمد لله سيدي. نقي ابراهيم. نعم سيدي. الحين نكتب يمك. اي طيب. الو الو تفضل سيدي. مرحبا. ابراهيم. نعم سيدي. نقي ابراهيم. وياك سيدي. رفع عبارة عوامل الاعصاب. عوامل الأعصاب أينما وردت في التعليمات اللاسلكية. اللاسلكية زيني صار.
Let's review a few selected items of this conversation. Two officers talking to each other on the radio want to make sure that nothing is misunderstood. Remove the expression, I got it. Nerve agents, wherever it comes up, got it, wherever it comes up, in the wireless instructions, in the instructions, correction, no, in the wireless instructions, wireless, I got it. Why does he repeat it that way? Why is he so forceful in making sure this is understood? And why did he focus on wireless instructions? Because the senior officer is concerned that somebody might be listening. Well, somebody was. Nerve agents. Stop talking about it. They're listening to us. Don't give any evidence that we have these horrible agents, but we know that they do, and this kind of conversation confirms it. Our conservative estimate is that Iraq today has a stockpile of between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agent. That is enough agent to fill 16,000 battlefield rockets. Even the low end of 100 tons of agent would enable Saddam Hussein to cause mass casualties across more than 100 square miles of territory, an area nearly 5 times the size of Manhattan. Let me remind you that of the 122 millimeter chemical warheads that the UN inspectors found recently, this discovery could very well be, as has been noted, the tip of a submerged iceberg. The question before us all, my friends, is when will we see the rest of the submerged iceberg? Saddam Hussein has chemical weapons. Saddam Hussein has used such weapons. And Saddam Hussein has no compunction about using them again against his neighbors and against his own people. And we have sources who tell us that he recently has authorized his field commanders to use them. He wouldn't be passing out the orders if he didn't have the weapons or the intent to use them. We also have sources who tell us that since the 1980s, Saddam's regime has been experimenting on human beings to perfect its biological or chemical weapons. A source said that 1,600 death row prisoners were transferred in 1995 to a special unit for such experiments. An eyewitness saw prisoners tied down to beds, experiments conducted on them, blood oozing around the victims' mouths, and autopsies performed to confirm the effects of the prisoners, on the prisoners. Saddam Hussein's inhumanity has no limits. Let me turn now to nuclear weapons. We have no indication that Saddam Hussein has ever abandoned his nuclear weapons program. On the contrary, we have more than a decade of proof that he remains determined to acquire nuclear weapons. To fully appreciate the challenge that we face today, remember that in 1991, the inspectors searched Iraq's primary nuclear weapons facilities for the first time, and they found nothing to conclude that Iraq had a nuclear weapons program. But based on defector information, in May of 1991, Saddam Hussein's lie was exposed. In truth, Saddam Hussein had a massive clandestine nuclear weapons program that covered several different techniques to enrich uranium, including electromagnetic isotope separation, gas centrifuge, and gas diffusion. We estimate that this illicit program cost the Iraqis several $billions. Nonetheless, Iraq continued to tell the IAEA that it had no nuclear weapons program. If Saddam had not been stopped, Iraq could have produced a nuclear bomb by 1993, years earlier than most worst-case assessments that had been made before the war. In 1995, as a result of another defector, we find out that after his invasion of Kuwait, Saddam Hussein had initiated a crash program to build a crude nuclear weapon in violation of Iraq's UN obligations. Saddam Hussein already possesses 2 out of the 3 key components needed to build a nuclear bomb. He has a cadre of nuclear scientists with the expertise, and he has a bomb design. Since 1998, his efforts to reconstitute his nuclear program have been focused on acquiring the 3rd and last component, sufficient fissile material to produce a nuclear explosion. To make the fissile material, he needs to develop an ability to enrich uranium. Saddam Hussein is determined to get his hands on a nuclear bomb. He is so determined that he has made repeated covert attempts to acquire high-specification aluminum tubes from 11 different countries, even after inspections resumed. These tubes are controlled by the Nuclear Suppliers Group precisely because they can be used as centrifuges for enriching uranium. By now, just about everyone has heard of these tubes, and we all know that there are differences of opinion. There is controversy about what these tubes are for. Most U.S. experts think they are intended to serve as rotors in centrifuges used to enrich uranium. Other experts and the Iraqis themselves argue that they are really to produce the rocket bodies for a conventional weapon, a multiple rocket launcher. Let me tell you what is not controversial about these tubes. First, all the experts who have analyzed the tubes in our possession agree that they can be adapted for centrifuge use. Second, Iraq had no business buying them for any purpose. They are banned for Iraq. I am no expert on centrifuge tubes, but just as an old Army trooper, I can tell you a couple of things. First, it strikes me as quite odd that these tubes are manufactured to a tolerance that far exceeds U.S. requirements for comparable rockets. Maybe the Iraqis just manufacture their conventional weapons to a higher standard than we do, but I don't think so. Second, we actually have examined tubes from several different batches that were seized clandestinely before they reached Baghdad. What we notice in these different batches is a progression to higher and higher levels of specification, including in the latest batch, an anodized coating on extremely smooth inner and outer surfaces. Why would they continue refining the specifications? Why would they continue refining the specification, go to all that trouble for something that, if it was a rocket, would soon be blown into shrapnel when it went off? The high-tolerance aluminum tubes are only part of the story. We also have intelligence from multiple sources that Iraq is attempting to acquire magnets and high-speed balancing machines. Both items can be used in a gas centrifuge program to enrich uranium. In 1999 and 2000, Iraqi officials negotiated with firms in Romania, India, Russia, and Slovenia for the purchase of a magnet production plant. Iraq wanted the plant to produce magnets weighing 20 to 30 grams. That's the same weight as the magnets used in Iraq's gas centrifuge program before the Gulf War. This incident, linked with the tubes, is another indicator of Iraq's attempt to reconstitute its nuclear weapons program. Intercepted communications from mid-2000 through last summer show that Iraq front companies sought to buy machines that can be used to balance gas centrifuge rotors. One of these companies also had been involved in a failed effort in 2001 to smuggle aluminum tubes into Iraq. People will continue to debate this issue, but there is no doubt in my mind these illicit procurement efforts show that Saddam Hussein is very much focused on putting in place the key missing piece from his nuclear weapons program, the ability to produce fissile material. He also has been busy trying to maintain the other key parts of his nuclear program, particularly his cadre of key nuclear scientists. It is noteworthy that over the last 18 months, Saddam Hussein has paid increasing personal attention to Iraqi's top nuclear scientists, a group that the government-controlled press calls openly his nuclear mujahideen. He regularly exhorts them and praises their progress. Progress towards what end? Long ago, the Security Council, this council, required Iraq to halt all nuclear activities of any kind. Let me talk now about the systems Iraq is developing to deliver weapons of mass destruction, in particular Iraq's ballistic missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. First, missiles. We all remember that before the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein's goal was missiles that flew not just hundreds, but thousands of kilometers. He wanted to strike not only his neighbors, but also nations far beyond his borders. While inspectors destroyed most of the prohibited ballistic missiles, numerous intelligence reports over the past decade from sources inside Iraq indicate that Saddam Hussein retains a covert force of up to a few dozen Scud variant ballistic missiles. These are missiles with a range of 650 to 900 kilometers. We know from intelligence and Iraq's own admissions that Iraq's alleged permitted ballistic missiles, the Al-Samud 2 and the Al-Fatah, violate the 150-kilometer limit established by this Council in Resolution 687. These are prohibited systems. UNMOVIC has also reported that Iraq has illegally imported 380 SA-2 rocket engines. These are likely for use in the Al-Samud 2. Their import was illegal on 3 counts. Resolution 687 prohibited all military shipments into Iraq. UNSCOM specifically prohibited use of these engines in surface-to-surface missiles. And finally, as we have just noted, they are for a system that exceeds the 150-kilometer range limit. Worst of all, some of these engines were acquired as late as December after this Council passed Resolution 1441. What I want you to know today is that Iraq has programs that are intended to produce ballistic missiles that fly over 1,000 kilometers. One program is pursuing a liquid fuel missile that would be able to fly more than 1,200 kilometers. And you can see from this map, as well as I can, who will be in danger of these missiles. As part of this effort, another little piece of evidence, Iraq has built an engine test stand that is larger than anything it has ever had. Notice the dramatic difference in size between the test stand on the left, the old one, and the new one on the right. Note the large exhaust vent. This is where the flame from the engine comes out. The exhaust vent on the right test stand is 5 times longer than the one on the left. The one on the left was used for short-range missiles. The one on the right is clearly intended for long-range missiles that can fly 1,200 kilometers. This photograph was taken in April of 2002. Since then, the test stand has been finished and a roof has been put over it, so it will be harder for satellites to see what's going on underneath the test stand. Saddam Hussein's intentions have never changed. He is not developing the missiles for self-defense. These are missiles that Iraq wants in order to project power, to threaten, and to deliver chemical, biological, and, if we let him, nuclear warheads. Now, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs. Iraq has been working on a variety of UAVs for more than a decade. This is just illustrative of what an UAV would look like. This effort has included attempts to modify for unmanned flight the MiG-21 and, with greater success, an aircraft called the L-29. However, Iraq is now concentrating not on these airplanes, but on developing and testing smaller UAVs such as this. UAVs are well suited for dispensing chemical and biological weapons. There is ample evidence that Iraq has dedicated much effort to developing and testing spray devices that can be adapted for UAVs. And in the little that Saddam Hussein told us about UAVs, he has not told the truth. One of these lies is graphically and indisputably demonstrated by intelligence we collected on June 27th last year. According to Iraq's December 7th declaration, its UAVs have a range of only 80 kilometers. But we detected one of Iraq's newest UAVs in a test flight that went 500 kilometers nonstop on autopilot in the racetrack pattern depicted here. Not only is this test well in excess of the 150 kilometers that the United States permits, the test was left out of Iraq's December 7th declaration. The UAV was flown around and around and around in this circle, and so that its 80-kilometer limit really was 500 kilometers unrefueled and on autopilot, violative of all of its obligations under 1441. The linkages over the past 10 years between Iraq's UAV program and biological and chemical warfare agents are of deep concern to us. Iraq could use these small UAVs, which have a wingspan of only a few meters, to deliver biological agents to its neighbors or if transported to other countries, including the United States. My friends, the information I have presented to you about these terrible weapons and about Iraq's continued flaunting of its obligations under Security Council Resolution 1441 links to a subject I now want to spend a little bit of time on, and that has to do with terrorism. Our concern is not just about these illicit weapons, it's the way that these illicit weapons can be connected to terrorists and terrorist organizations that have no compunction about using such devices against innocent people around the world. Iraq and terrorism go back decades. Baghdad trains Palestine Liberation Front members in small arms and explosives. Saddam uses the Arab Liberation Front to funnel money to the families of Palestinian suicide bombers in order to prolong the Intifada. And it's no secret that Saddam's own intelligence service was involved in dozens of attacks or attempted assassinations in the 1990s. But what I want to bring to your attention today is the potentially much more sinister nexus between Iraq and the al-Qaeda terrorist network, a nexus that combines classic terrorist organizations and modern methods of murder. Iraq today harbors a deadly terrorist network headed by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, an associate and collaborator of Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda lieutenants. Zarqawi, a Palestinian born in Jordan, fought in the Afghan war more than a decade ago. Returning to Afghanistan in 2000, he oversaw a terrorist training camp. One of his specialties, and one of the specialties of this camp, is poisons. When our coalition ousted the Taliban, the Zarqawi network helped establish another poison and explosive training center camp, and this camp is located in northeastern Iraq. And you see a picture of this camp. The network is teaching its operatives how to produce ricin and other poisons. Let me remind you how ricin works. Less than a pinch. Imagine a pinch of salt. Less than a pinch of ricin. Eating just this amount in your food would cause shock, followed by circulatory failure. Death comes within 72 hours, and there is no antidote, there is no cure. It is fatal. Those helping to run this camp are Zarqawi lieutenants operating in northern Kurdish areas outside Saddam Hussein's controlled Iraq. But Baghdad has an agent in the most senior levels of the radical organization Ansar al-Islam that controls this corner of Iraq. In 2000, this agent offered al-Qaeda safe haven in the region. After we swept al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, some of its members accepted this safe haven. They remain there today. Zarqawi's activities are not confined to this small corner of northeast Iraq. He traveled to Baghdad in May 2002 for medical treatment, staying in the capital of Iraq for 2 months while he recuperated to fight another day. During this stay, nearly 24 extremists converged on Baghdad and established a base of operations there. These al-Qaeda affiliates based in Baghdad now coordinate the movement of people, money, and supplies into and throughout Iraq for his network. And they've now been operating freely in the capital for more than 8 months. Iraqi officials deny accusations of ties with al-Qaeda. These denials are simply not credible. Last year, an al-Qaeda associate bragged that the situation in Iraq was, quote, good, that Baghdad could be transited quickly. We know these affiliates are connected to Zarqawi because they remain, even today, in regular contact with his direct subordinates including the poison cell plotters. And they are involved in moving more than money and materiel. Last year, 2 suspected al-Qaeda operatives were arrested crossing from Iraq into Saudi Arabia. They were linked to associates of the Baghdad cell, and one of them received training in Afghanistan on how to use cyanide. From his terrorist network in Iraq, Zarqawi can direct his network in the Middle East and beyond. We in the United States, all of us at the State Department and the Agency for International Development, we all lost a dear friend with the cold-blooded murder of Mr. Lawrence Foley in Amman, Jordan, last October. A despicable act was committed that day, the assassination of an individual whose sole mission was to assist the people of Jordan. The captured assassin says his cell received money and weapons from Zarqawi for that murder. After the attack, an associate of the assassin left Jordan to go to Iraq to obtain weapons and explosives for further operations. Iraqi officials protest that they are not aware of the whereabouts of Zarqawi or of any of his associates. Again, these protests are not credible. We know of Zarqawi's activities in Baghdad. I described them earlier, and now let me add one other fact. We asked a friendly security service to approach Baghdad about extraditing Zarqawi and providing information about him and his close associates. This service contacted Iraqi officials twice, and we passed details that should have made it easy to find Zarqawi. The network remains in Baghdad. Zarqawi still remains at large to come and go. As my colleagues around this table and as the citizens they represent in Europe know, Zarqawi's terrorism is not confined to the Middle East. Zarqawi and his network have plotted terrorist actions against countries including France, Britain, Spain, Italy, Germany, and Russia. According to detainees, Abu Atiyah, who graduated from Zarqawi's terrorist camp in Afghanistan, tasked at least 9 North African extremists in 2001 to travel to Europe to conduct poison and explosive attacks. Since last year, members of this network have been apprehended in France, Britain, Spain, and Italy. By our last count, 116 operatives connected to this global web have been arrested. The chart you are seeing shows the network in Europe. We know about this European network, and we know about its links to Zarqawi because the detainee who provided the information about the targets also provided the names of members of the network. 3 of those he identified by name were arrested in France last December. In the apartments of the terrorists, authorities found circuits for explosive devices and a list of ingredients to make toxins. The detainee who helped piece this together says the plot also targeted Britain. Later evidence again proved him right. When the British unearthed a cell there just last month, 1 British police officer was murdered during the disruption of the cell. We also know that Zarqawi's colleagues have been active in the Pankisi Gorge, Georgia, and in Chechnya, Russia. The plotting to which they are linked is not mere chatter. Members of Zarqawi's network say their goal was to kill Russians with toxins. We are not surprised that Iraq is harboring Zarqawi and his subordinates. This understanding builds on decades-long experience with respect to ties between Iraq and al-Qaeda. Going back to the early and mid-1990s, when bin Laden was based in Sudan, an al-Qaeda source tells us that Saddam and bin Laden reached an understanding that al-Qaeda would no longer support activities against Baghdad. Early al-Qaeda ties were forged by secret high-level intelligence service contacts with al-Qaeda, secret Iraqi intelligence high-level contacts with al-Qaeda. We know members of both organizations met repeatedly and have met at least 8 times at very senior levels since the early 1990s. In 1996, the Foreign Security Service tells us that bin Laden met with a senior Iraqi intelligence official in Khartoum and later met the director of the Iraqi intelligence service. Saddam became more interested as he saw al-Qaeda's appalling attacks. A detained al-Qaeda member tells us that Saddam was more willing to assist al-Qaeda After the 1998 bombings of our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, Saddam was also impressed by al-Qaeda's attacks on the USS Cole in Yemen in October 2000. Iraqis continued to visit bin Laden in his new home in Afghanistan. A senior defector, one of Saddam's former intelligence chiefs in Europe, says Saddam sent his agents to Afghanistan sometime in the mid-1990s to provide training to al-Qaeda members on document forgery. From the late 1990s until 2001, the Iraqi embassy in Pakistan played the role of liaison to the al-Qaeda organization. Some believe, some claim these contacts do not amount to much. They say Saddam Hussein's secular tyranny and al-Qaeda's religious tyranny do not mix. I am not comforted by this thought. Ambition and hatred are enough to bring Iraq and al-Qaeda together, enough so al-Qaeda could learn how to build more sophisticated bombs and learn how to forge documents, and enough so that al-Qaeda could turn to Iraq for help in acquiring expertise on weapons of mass destruction. And the record of Saddam Hussein's cooperation with other Islamist terrorist organizations is clear. Hamas, for example, opened an office in Baghdad in 1999, and Iraq has hosted conferences attended by Palestine Islamic Jihad. These groups are at the forefront of sponsoring suicide attacks against Israel. Al-Qaeda continues to have a deep interest in acquiring weapons of mass destruction. As with the story of Zarqawi and his network, I can trace the story of a senior terrorist operative telling how Iraq provided training in these weapons to al-Qaeda. Fortunately, this operative is now detained, and he has told his story. I will relate it to you now as he himself described it. This senior al-Qaeda terrorist was responsible for one of al-Qaeda's training camps in Afghanistan. His information comes firsthand from his personal involvement at senior levels of al-Qaeda. He says bin Laden and his top deputy in Afghanistan, deceased al-Qaeda leader Mohammed Atif, did not believe that al-Qaeda labs in Afghanistan were capable enough to manufacture these chemical or biological agents. They needed to go somewhere else. They had to look outside of Afghanistan for help. Where did they go? Where did they look? They went to Iraq. The support that Husseini describes included Iraq offering chemical or biological weapons training for 2 al-Qaeda associates beginning in December 2000. He says that a militant known as Abu Abdallah al-Iraqi had been sent to Iraq several times between 1997 and 2000 for help in acquiring poisons and gases. Abdullah al-Iraqi characterized the relationship he forged with Iraqi officials as successful. As I said at the outset, none of this should come as a surprise to any of us. Terrorism has been a tool used by Saddam for decades. Saddam was a supporter of terrorism long before these terrorist networks had a name. And this support continues. The nexus of poisons and terror is new. The nexus of Iraq and terror is old. The combination is lethal. With this track record, Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies. When we confront a regime that harbors ambitions for regional domination, hides weapons of mass destruction, and provides haven and active support for terrorists, we are not confronting the past. We are confronting the present. And unless we act, we are confronting an even more frightening future. My friends, this has been a long and a detailed presentation, and I thank you for your patience, but there is one more subject that I would like to touch on briefly, and it should be a subject of deep and continuing concern to this Council: Saddam Hussein's violations of human rights. Underlying all that I have said, underlying all the facts and the patterns of behavior that I have identified, is Saddam Hussein's contempt for the will of this Council, his contempt for the truth, and most damning of all, his utter contempt for human life. Saddam Hussein's use of mustard and nerve gas against the Kurds in 1988 was one of the 20th century's most horrible atrocities. 5,000 men, women, and children died. His campaign against the Kurds from 1987 to 89 included mass summary executions, disappearances, arbitrary jailing, ethnic cleansing, and the destruction of some 2,000 villages. He has also conducted ethnic cleansing against the Shia Iraqis and the Marsh Arabs, whose culture has flourished for more than a millennium. Saddam Hussein's police state ruthlessly eliminates anyone who dares to dissent. Iraq has more forced disappearance cases than any other country. Tens of thousands of people were reported missing in the past decade. Nothing points more clearly to Saddam Hussein's dangerous intentions and the threat he poses to all of us than his calculated cruelty to his own citizens and to his neighbors. Clearly, Saddam Hussein and his regime will stop at nothing until something stops him. For more than 20 years, by word and by deed, Saddam Hussein has pursued his ambition to dominate Iraq and the broader Middle East using the only means he knows: intimidation, coercion, and annihilation of all those who might stand in his way. For Saddam Hussein, possession of the world's most deadly weapons is the ultimate trump card, the one he must hold to fulfill his ambition. We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more. Given Saddam Hussein's history of aggression, given what we know of his grandiose plans, given what we know of his terrorist associations, and given his determination to exact revenge on those who oppose him, should we take the risk that he will not someday use these weapons at a time and a place and in a manner of his choosing, at a time when the world is in a much weaker position to respond? The United States will not and cannot run that risk to the American people. Leaving Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction for a few more months or years is not an option, not in a post-September 11th world. My colleagues, over 3 months ago, this Council recognized that Iraq continued to pose a threat to international peace and security, and that Iraq had been and remained in material breach of its disarmament obligations. Today, Iraq still poses a threat, and Iraq still remains in material breach. Indeed, by its failure to seize on its one last opportunity to come clean and disarm, Iraq has put itself in deeper material breach and closer to the day when it will face serious consequences for its continued defiance of this Council. My colleagues, we have an obligation to our citizens. We have an obligation to this body to see that our resolutions are complied with. We wrote 1441 not in order to go to war. We wrote 1441 to try to preserve the peace. We wrote 1441 to give Iraq one last chance. Iraq is not so far taking that one last chance. We must not shrink from whatever is ahead of us. We must not fail in our duty and our responsibility to the citizens of the countries that are represented by this body. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished Secretary of State of the United States of America for his statement.